Welcome and happy Sabbath. We are excited to have all of you here tonight, those of you that are joining us here physically, and I know there's already a lot of you joining us here online as well. Today is a emotional, happy day because we are going to initiate something that we've been looking forward to for a while now, which is this series of family seminars. We're excited and we're happy. We're thankful that Dr. Bryan is here with us today and for the rest of the day tomorrow as well. So we look forward to being able to learn together and spend some time together as well. With that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. Those of you that are here physically present, I'm going to invite you to stand as we pray and we initiate these series. And those of you online as well, you're welcome to join us as we pray here together tonight. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we want to say thank you. Just thank you for who you are. Thank you for being such a loving and kind God. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for this moment that you've granted us, where we come together as a church, as a family, and we are united, not only in those of us that are here physically, but in spirit. So Lord, as we begin this series that we've been looking forward to for a while now, we wouldn't want to do it without knowing that your Spirit is guiding us and is with us. So that is why we ask, first and foremost, forgiveness for our sins. Forgive us for the ways that we have done wrong towards you. But at this moment, we ask that you may cleanse us with the blood of Jesus, so that as we hear your word tonight and tomorrow and this weekend, that we may come close to you. And that as a result of being in your presence and seeing your light, that we may come closer to one another, that we may be strong families that uplift the name of Jesus and that we heal and love one another. So thank you once again for this opportunity that you've given us. Thank you for always looking out for us, even when we don't deserve it. All of this we ask and pray, Lord, not because any of us here deserve it or any of us have earned it, but because we pray and we believe that there is one who does deserve it, and there is one that is worthy. And it's in his name that we pray, in Jesus Christ. Amen. Very well, as we begin this series this weekend, before handing the microphone off here to Dr. Bryan, I'd like to present him first and foremost, give a little bit of his educational background, a little bit of his personal background as well. So his name is Dr. Bryan Cafferky, those of you that have been able to see the flyers and the announcements online. He has a PhD in marriage and family therapy. His MDiv is an emphasis in family ministry. He's licensed for marriage and family therapy. He is AAMFT approved supervisor and certified family life educator. He has 10 years performing and teaching improv theater. Some of his personal adventures, he's married to Jenny, let me see if I say that right, Tilley, okay. He's a proud father of two awesome daughters. He's a travel enthusiast. He's a fantasy football champion. We might have to take him up on that. He loves playing basketball, strategy board games, and Frisbee. And he's a self-proclaimed pie and cinnamon roll connoisseur. So with that being said, Dr. Bryan, we appreciate you being here. Thank you for taking up this challenge, and time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Here we go. I hear that now. Good. So I was pleased to see, when I jumped online here to Ogden SDA Church, I saw some of the sermons, and I clipped through a few of the sermons to listen to what you were talking about in May. And I was pleased to hear that we were talking about Abraham's family, because we're going to be doing that again now, but hopefully that story is fresh in your mind, because we're going to be going very quickly through the story. We're not going to be spending too much time on each little story. We're more interested in the patterns and the rules that are seem to be presenting themselves in each generation. So I'm going to socially locate myself. So social location is about intersectionality. So you kind of get to know about who I am. So I identify as a 41-year-old cisgender Caucasian heterosexual male. I've been a SDA for 4 generations, fourth generation SDA. I'm a 3rd generation Irish American. I'm married, been married for 10 years. I have 2 children. I work at Lumland University. I teach marriage and family therapy there in the Counseling and Family Sciences department. So I do research. Most of my research is focused on how at-risk families respond to crisis and trauma. I also do research with the military. I'm an abstract sequential thinker. I do improvisational theater. I'm able-bodied. I can lift things and move things around. We just moved about a month ago, so I was moving boxes up and down stairs every weekend. So I'm glad to be done with that, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to talk with you about Abraham's family. I'm guessing you know a little bit about him. Here's my family. I have 2 daughters. The 4-year-old is Penelope, and the youngest one is Phoenix, and they are at home right now doing bedtime routine. And so Mama is missing me, but I know that she'll be taking good care of them while I'm here. So the plan tonight is to walk through Abraham's family as fast as we can. We're going to be rushing through this, and then tomorrow I'll be preaching, and then tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow evening we'll be talking about relational triangles and how we can get caught in different relationships and how to de-triangulate ourselves so we can have a little more freedom to do what we want to do, which is in accordance with our own values, instead of doing what other people want us to do. I love this quote here. Family dysfunction rolls down from generation to generation, like a fire in the woods, taking down everything in its path until one person in one generation has the courage to turn and face the flames. That person brings peace to their ancestors and spares the children that follow. You have a lot of power to change the experience in your own family. And sometimes it feels like the family does things to us and we don't have a lot of power to do a lot of changes in the rest of the family because it's other people and that's them and this is us. But we actually have quite a bit of power if we can notice the different patterns in our lives and the patterns in our family. And after we increase our awareness of those patterns, we can make some intentional decisions to change the way we are operating as individuals. So we're going to be focusing on Abraham's family, and we'll be looking at his family tree. Now, most of you have probably seen a family tree before, where you have the different generations and different rows, and you start the upper generation, kind of move down. We're going to be looking at a family tree that's a little bit different. It's called a genogram. A genogram is like a family tree, so it's going to look like this, but there are going to be some relational interaction lines. Let's just start here to make sure we're all on the same page. So up here we have Thornton and Becca. So when you look at a genogram, the males are always on the top left in a marital relationship. So Thornton is in a marital relationship with Becca, and Thornton has passed away, and they have 3 children. The eldest is Tyson, the middle one is James, the youngest is Christy. James has passed away, but James was married to Roxy. Are we seeing that? See the connection there? And James and Roxy's eldest son was Jeff, and the youngest daughter was Trisha. Over on this side, so Roxy, we do not know Roxy's father's name. Big question mark. We're not sure. Her mother was Gladys. Gladys has passed away. These double lines means there is a divorce. On the right-hand side, we have Ricky and Catalina. They had twins. So 2 lines coming from the same spot means there's twins, Roberto and Martin. Martin has passed away. Roberto was married to Karina, who's also passed away. And Roberto and Karina had 3 children. Sophia was the eldest daughter. The middle son was Emily, but Emily was transgender. So now this is Emily. He changed his name to her, so Emily. Here's Damien. Damien and Lily, they've been divorced. They have a son, Berenice. They have a daughter, Berenice. Right now, this whole genogram is focused on Dahlia. Dahlia has this little square around her, so we know that this is the genogram from her perspective. I'm going to add some of these relational lines. I'll walk through these. So this is the same family, just with a whole bunch of other lines added onto it. I want to walk through some of these lines because we'll be using these to look at Abraham's family. There's a legend down here in the bottom left-hand corner. So 2 parallel green lines means a close relationship. 3 red lines means a fused relationship, or they're emotionally enmeshed, maybe too close. When one person is upset, the other person is also automatically upset. Their emotional is too tight, they don't have a lot of space to breathe. If there's this red jagged line, that means there's conflict between individuals. If there's a blue line with an arrow, that means there's some sort of abuse or manipulation happening. If there's a dotted gray line, this means emotional distance. And if there's a dotted red line with these little hash marks in the middle, that means there's some sort of emotional cutoff. Oftentimes that means these two people are no longer really conversing very much. Maybe during Christmas or Thanksgiving, but they sit on opposite sides of the table, that sort of thing. So we'll walk through this. So it looks like Thornton and Becca, there is some sort of emotional cutoff between them. In fact, Becca and Tyson, Becca and James, there was emotional cutoff as well. But it looks like Becca is very, very close, maybe too close with Christy. Are we seeing that so far? Those of us here in person? Okay. Looks like Roxy is the sort of a lot of difficulty in this family, right? So there's, looks like Gladys abused Roxy. Roxy was the perpetrator abusing Christy, as well as Jeff and Trisha. And there's still some conflict between Roxy and Karina, Roxy and Sophia, Roxy and Hannah. So Roxy right now, she is in a lot of pain. She has difficulty navigating her relationship with other people. Maybe of no fault of her own, maybe she just wasn't shown a very good pattern of how to walk through life and how to interact with other people. We see that Roberto and Martin were very close before Martin passed away. Roberto is very close with Emily, maybe because Emily has some similar characteristics to his stepbrother. I don't know. We know that Roberto is close with Jeff as well, and Trisha and Hannah are very close. And looks like Jeff, he's very close with Philip, and Sophia is very close with Dahlia. And Dahlia and Philip have a little bit of conflict. How are we feeling about this? Yes, question. Good question. If there's conflict, it means there's some unresolved tension. If you and I don't get along, and we continue to not get along, we just become a little bit frustrated, and we can't get over our frustration. That's the conflict. So it's kind of frustration that stays and lingers in the family. Excellent question. Someone else asked me a question about this before I move on. Yes? Good. Why is there only one fused relationship? That's awesome. Whoever made this, that was Bryan, decided to only put one there. But some families, there's more than one fused relationship, right? In some families, there might be more abuse or less abuse. Maybe there's more fused relationship or less. So every single family is different. And this is just the characteristic of this particular family. Awesome question. Someone else ask me another question before we move on. Okay, I'll take the silence to indicate that we feel like we have a pretty good handle on this. We'll be using this same sort of theme of the genogram and the relational lines to track what's happening in Abraham's family in the book of Genesis. So if we're familiar here, we'll see these same sort of patterns coming up. Okay, so we'll be talking about stress and anxiety tonight, and I'm going to be using them interchangeably. There are some subtle and maybe important differences between stress and anxiety in the clinical world. So I'm practicing marriage and family therapist, so I work with couples and families, individuals. I focus on trauma quite a bit. And so I think about stress and anxiety on a daily basis. So when we think about stress, usually we know what is stressing us. I'm stressed out because I have taxes due on April 15th. Or I'm stressed out because I have to pay rent. Or I'm stressed out because my father-in-law is coming to visit for Thanksgiving. So I know the reason why I'm feeling a little bit anxious. Whereas anxiety it's hard to kind of put our finger on. I don't know exactly why I'm feeling anxious. It's hard for me to know. I just know that I'm feeling nervous and uncomfortable right now. So stress, you know what it is. You know what it is in your anxiety. Whereas anxiety, we're not always sure. We just know we're a little bit overwhelmed. I'll be using them interchangeably. Because stress and anxiety, we can pass those on from one person to the next. If someone started to yell, fire, fire, fire in this room, everyone would look around to see what's going on, right? So immediately, one person's frustration or anxiety can spread across the whole room. The same thing happens in our family. We can inadvertently pass down anxiety and stress and maybe our coping skills and the patterns in the family that keep the anxiety and the stress locked in those different generations. We can pass those down like a precious family heirloom to the next generation. And they receive that, and they pass that down to the next generation. And this pattern will continue over and over and over until someone notices the pattern and decides to make a change. So, I'm assuming that most of us here and online know a little bit about the story of Abraham. If you don't, there's a Oh, good. A company moves in. Appreciate that. If you don't know the story very well, we're going very quickly, so I'd recommend you go through it on your own and look through the story of Genesis. So we're looking at the family rules, looking at the intergenerational patterns of behavior. This just simply means there are patterns in one generation which are repeated in the next generation, which are repeated in the next generation, so on and so forth. We'll be looking at how people manage conflict, the frustration, how they resolve the frustration. And we'll also be looking at who the villains are and who the heroes are in the family. Because who you are in the family and how other people see you definitely changes who you are to the rest of your family. So how many of you have siblings? Raise your hand if you have a sibling. Okay, great. You and your sibling or siblings grew up in different families, meaning your experience of your family was different from your brother or your sister's experience of the family. So even though you grew up in the same household, your experience of the family was different. So we all grow up in different families, even if we're siblings. How are we feeling about this idea? And I think we'll see this in this Abrahamic narrative. The siblings in the family grow up in a different family, right? There are some siblings get some special treatment from one parent or the other. Yes, you have a question?
Can like a bigger brother or sister be like a sibling?
Yes, a bigger brother or sister could be a sibling. That's right. But if there's a big age gap, sometimes the older brother and sister, if there's maybe an 8, 10, 12, 16-year age gap, there's definitely growing up in a different family, right? Because there's a generation and a half or potentially between you and the youngest sibling. So who we grew up with in our family changes who we are. When we're thinking about nature and nurture, tonight we're focused on the nurture piece. So what do we learn in our family, and how do we carry those rules on with us to the next generation? So if you think about the story of Abraham, first question I want you to think about, what chapter does Abraham's story begin? And then who is Abram and Sarai's first son? So you know that Abram and Sarai, their names will change to Abraham and Sarah, correct? So I want you to think in your head, who were Abram and Sarai's, who was their first son? Just kind of hold on to that for a little bit. So this is where we begin, Abram and Sarai. And we start in Genesis chapter 11. God calls them, but before God calls them, we first are introduced to who they are. And one of the first things we know is that Sarai was barren. She had no children. So before we know that she's beautiful, we learn that she's barren. Before we learn that she can't have children, so first we learn she can't have children, and then later on we learn that she is his half-sister. So the challenge here is barrenness, infertility. This is how the story starts. My family experienced infertility. Our two girls have come about because of IVF, which is like a modern miracle. So the embryos were frozen for months, and then thawed out. It's amazing how this works, but during that point in time, they don't have the same sort of technology, right? Right? So they're experiencing infertility. This is how we get to know the family. And this is one of the driving factors in the Abrahamic narrative. And each generation struggles with this. Each generation experiences this barrenness. This time of year is actually a pretty important time when it comes to infertility, because the last week of April was the National Infertility Awareness Week, and then we have Mother's Day, and then we had Father's Day in like a few weeks. So this time of year is actually pretty difficult for families who experience infertility, for those who want to have children but are not able to. The definition of infertility is a disease or condition of the reproductive system, often diagnosed after a couple has had 1 year of unprotected, well-timed intercourse, and or a woman has suffered from multiple miscarriages, and the woman is under 35 years old, or if the woman is over 35-year-old and is diagnosed after 6 months of unprotected, well-timed intercourse. So 1 in 8 individuals currently experience some sort of difficulty getting pregnant, and 1 in 4 women will experience some sort of miscarriage in their lifetime. And the word miscarriage is never mentioned in the Old Testament, or at least in the book of Genesis. And we know that right now, Abram and Sarai, Abram is 75 when the story starts, and Sarai is 65. So I think it's not too long of a stretch to wonder if they had some difficulties getting or staying pregnant in this family. And this is really what's the driving force, because when you think about how God called Abraham, look at the language that he uses. God says, go forth from your country and from your relatives, from your father's house. So we have the land and the family focus. To the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. and in you all of the families of the earth will be blessed. So in this call, there are two main themes: family and land. Are we seeing that so far? Family and land. And this is not a new theme. If you go back previously to the 3rd chapter of Genesis, so the fall of Adam and Eve, after the fall of Adam and Eve, after they take the fruit and eat of it, God comes and he says to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you, and in pain you shall eat of it. All the days of your life, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you." I want you to focus on this. In pain you shall eat of it. So I had to do some yard work this last week. Unpleasant. I don't like yard work, but I do it if I need to. But luckily, I don't have to right now, I don't have to till the ground, plant the seeds, water the seeds, tend the seeds. That's a lot of work, right? That's a lot of pain and sweat. But I don't think that's what God is talking about right now. I don't think God is talking about the pain and sweat of hard work. The real pain of trying to get food out of the ground is not the sweat, it's not the blisters, it's when the food doesn't come, right? Famine, that's the real pain of the land, when you're working hard trying to produce food and the food doesn't come. Similarly, when he talks to Eve, he says, to the woman, he said, "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth, and in pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Now, I'm not going to mansplain this because I've never given birth myself. But in my experience with my wife, the pain that we experience as a family isn't just from the birthing experience, it's from the infertility. More pain due to the barrenness than giving of birth. I think this is what God is talking about. Wanting to have children and not being able to produce children. Wanting to make food out of the ground, and the ground is not producing food. This is what he's talking about. And one of the big questions in Genesis is, how is Abraham's family going to deal with famine? Because this happens in every single generation. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, every generation there's famine. And as well as every single generation, there's infertility. So how is this family going to deal with the pain of the land and the pain of not having children? And this is one thing that's driving this story. And so far, when you've been introduced to Genesis, oftentimes we probably think about how do the characters in the story interact with the divine? How do the characters in the story interact with God? And that's what we're interested in. But for a moment, just for a few minutes, I want you to suspend the theological importance and the Christological importance and the eschatological importance of these stories and just look at the family with me. We're going to be observing the family through this one-way mirror of time. We get to watch them and read about them and observe their family patterns. And at the very end of this presentation tonight, I promise you will come back and make some reflections about how humanity interacts with the divine and how God and Jesus interacts with us. I promise you we will do that. But let's just look at these stories and just pretend you're observing these families. You're just watching them through the window to see what happens. So Abram marries his half-sister Sarai, and Abraham's brother Nahor marries his niece Milcah. And so now I've kind of moved these characters over here so we can see that they are related here. So now they are married, and these two are married. And these characters are mentioned in chapter 11 of Genesis before we actually get to God's call. Now, who likes to check their emails? One person likes to check their email. Okay. Two people like to check. Okay. Why aren't other people raising your hands? Because what? It's overwhelming. Well, you can thank the Sumerians for that because they created cuneiform. They created the first form of writing. So if you don't like email, you can blame them. Right down here, if you've heard the phrase, "I don't want to recreate the wheel," they created the wheel. In fact, this civilization down here was very advanced for over 1,000 years. They had this advanced technology. They were able to grow more wheat and barley than the rest of the I'll get to your hands, I promise. The rest of the surrounding region. They had paved streets in their city. They had running water in their cities. So this is a very metropolitan area and very civilized area. And so out of this area, Abram and Sarai move up here, and then they move here to the wild, wild west. So there's a big difference between the Bedouin-type lifestyle, living in tents, versus living in this metropolitan, cosmopolitan city. Yes, question over here. So the reason Ur was most advanced was one of the first cities, right? And it has a Tigris and Euphrates right here, so it has access to water, which is one of the big reasons they're able to continue to grow food. Whereas over here, sometimes if we have lack of water, it's hard to grow the food we want to eat, right? Good. So we have Abram and Sarai. And again, coming back to this question, who was Abram and Sarai's first son? Ishmael. Okay, any other answers? Isaac. Any other answers? What would you say if I said their first son wasn't Isaac and it wasn't Ishmael? What would you say? So Abraham, after the call of God, went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now, Lot is his nephew, correct? But Lot's father passed away, right? And the narrator is making it very, very clear that Lot, the nephew, has joined Abram's family. And Lot went with him. Now, Abram was 75 years old, and he's departed from Haran. And again, the narrator just want to make sure we don't miss this point. Abram took Sarah and his wife, and Lot, his nephew. Abram and Sarah have adopted Lot. We didn't have the foster care system back then. When your parents pass away, there were no orphanages. You go live with another family member. And that's what's happening here. And we can see in Genesis 12, Abram goes down and he lies to Pharaoh about Sarai being his half-sister, right? And then after Pharaoh finds out, he says, "What have you done to me? Like, get out of here. I'm going to give you these gifts." So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife, and all that belonged to him. So he got some maidservants, some manservants, some donkeys, some camels, and Lot went with him. And the narrator just wants us to make sure that Lot is now part of this family. Now Lot, who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents. And so we know the story about how Abraham and Lot have come together, and there's their herds are fighting over the same sort of land. So Abraham says, "Okay, where do you want to go? You choose the land that you and your shepherds want to go pasture at, and I'll choose the other side." And so Lot chooses Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The nice, fertile land. But Abram gives him the choice. So it's clear that Abram cares for Lot. Abram also rescues Lot. If you remember the story, there are 4 kings from the east that come. They're kind of taxing the area, and they're saying, if you don't give us some tribute, some tax, we're going to come and punish you. And so Sodom and Gomorrah don't feel like giving the tax, and so the 4 kings from the east come, and they take Abram from Sodom and Gomorrah, and they take them off as slaves, and Abram says, not under my watch. So he gets his friends together, and he goes and he chases after and rescues Lot, even though that army is much bigger than him and his friends. And then we know that Abraham also bargains for Lot's life. Remember that story? Where we have the 3 visitors of God, and he bargains with God. What if there are 50? What if there are 45? What if there are 40? What if there are 30? What if there are 20? What if there are only 10 righteous individuals in Sodom and Gomorrah? Will you still destroy the city? So it's clear that Abraham is very interested in preserving Lot. We know that in this story, Hagar, which will be one of the maidservants, probably gathered from Egypt after Abraham and Sarah went down there. We know that Sarah cannot be pregnant, right? And so what's her sweet solution? Well, let's just bring in Hagar, right? She can be the person to kind of bear us some children so we can continue on the family line. Now, most of us see Sarah as being impatient, unfaithful, right? Maybe not believing in God's promise. Is this correct? How are we feeling about this? That she was just not waiting, like she should have been sitting and waiting for God's promise a little bit longer. And we clearly know that that Ishmael is the son of Hagar and Abraham, and Isaac is the biological son of Sarah and Abraham. And we make this big distinction between them. But I'm curious if anyone off the top of their heads can tell me, in future generations, when you're thinking about the 12 sons of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob, and there's Leah and Rachel and Zilpah and Bilhah, do we know which of those 12 sons come from each of the mothers? Can anyone off the top here remember which of the sons came from the maidservants versus Leah versus Rachel? I think we make a big distinction here, but later on in the story, we don't make as big of a distinction. Are we feeling that difference? Oh, it's just the 12 sons. But here, it's clearly Ishmael, and then over here is Isaac. There's a big difference. And I'm wondering if having a maidservant come and partake in trying to give birth was just part of the fertility process. In fact, when Rebekah comes and she marries Isaac, she comes with a nurse, a maidservant. Leah and Rachel both have maidservants. So everybody has maidservants, but Sarah does not. There's a maidservant that comes up with them from Egypt, but I wonder if this is Sarah's just attempt to try and get pregnant. In fact, this whole idea of polygamy, it's clear the Bible has a very specific stance on polygamy, and the way the stories are told, that it's not as good as God's original plan. But I think the reason polygamy is so important is so that they can have children. If you marry an individual and you're not able to have children with them, if you bring in someone else, then we can still carry on the family line. So I think that polygamy is driven by wanting to have children. It's driven by this desire to not be infertile anymore, to get past the barrenness. So those of you who back home were interested, these are the different sons of Israel and their biological mothers, if this is something you were interested in looking at. If you want to memorize for this next time, so that if I come to your church and ask you a question, you can say, I know exactly which sons were from Rachel, which ones from Leah, which one from Bilhah and Zilpah. So again, I think most of us make a big distinction at the beginning, but then 2 generations later we just say, they're all just 12 sons of Jacob. No, don't make that big of a distinction between them. So we know that Hagar and Sarah have some difficulty, right? And Hagar runs away, and God finds Hagar in the desert, says, no, go back, because I will also bless your son as well. So there's this unresolved conflict. Here's our first relational line. We saw this maybe like 10 minutes ago, right? This jagged red line means there's some unresolved conflict, this frustration that's still stuck, and it's not going away because they're having difficulty resolving their frustration. So we know that Hagar is running south here. This is where God meets her and says, go back. So she's running back home to Egypt. That's what's happening. She's trying to run away, and she feels like her life would be better if she runs away from the mistreatment into the barren desert and somehow survives as a pregnant woman trying to go all the way back home. God sends her back. She ends up giving birth to Ishmael. We know that there's some more infertility happening because after Ishmael comes along, there's still not Isaac. So Lot's still there. He's still there, but now he's living over in Sodom and Gomorrah. This is when the 3 visitors come, 3 messengers, and Abraham pleads with them and bargains with them. Suppose there are only 10 that are found that are not righteous. That are righteous, will you still destroy the city? And I want to point out that Abraham is not a morning person. How do we know Abraham is not a morning person? Because there are 3 times in the story of Genesis when Abraham gets up early. Only 3 times. Here's the first time. Here, we'll start with the last one. Genesis 22, this is right before the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, when God has told Abraham to take his son, his only son, at that time, Isaac, up to Mount Moriah. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. What's happening here, their narrator of Genesis is slowing down the story. He's using 6 different verbs. He rose, he saddled, he took, he split, he rose, he went. This is an old man who has plenty of resources. Abraham does not need to be doing this. Anyone else can do this for him, but he is doing this. And the narrator is slowing down the time so we can see Abraham doing this very slowly, I think indicating there's a chance this is a big moment in his life, right? This might be the last time. We know that by faith, this is not what happens, but there's a chance this is the last time Abraham might be with his son in the camp, with his son Isaac. Here's the second time it happens. So notice 1 chapter earlier. So Abraham rose early in the morning. Very similar, right? And took the bread and skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy, that's Isaac, and sent her away. Again, 6 verbs. Ray is slowing this down, that Abraham is not a morning person, and he's doing these tasks that any of his servants could have done for him. But this is important to him, because this might be one of the last times that he sees his son. Here's the very first time this happens. In Genesis 19. So Abraham rose early in the morning and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord bargaining. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and he looked toward all the land of the valley, and he saw and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of the furnace. And if you're Abraham, and you're getting up early to see this, and you look down, and you see the fire and the brimstone and the smoke, what do you think Abraham thought happened? Fire, yeah. That there were not 10 righteous people in the city, which he was right. But even though there were still not 10, the angels still rescued Lot. So it's clear there are 3 times that Abraham gets up early in the morning. First with Lot, might be the last time he sees Lot. Ishmael might be the last time he sees Ishmael. And then with Isaac, the last time that he's going to be in camp with Isaac. It's clear that Abraham really cares about Lot. But we often don't give Lot the same sort of weight because he's not a biological son, as if someone being adopted is not as important as someone who's biologically related through birth. And that's not necessarily the case. Adopted children, half siblings, full biological children, they're all children in the family, and we can all take care of them. As soon as we start to see one sort of child as not as important as, the way we treat them, our attitude towards them, can negatively affect their experience in our family. Okay, so we know that Abraham lies, again, about his wife being his sister. This time he lies to King Abimelech, who's the king of the Philistines. And the word Abimelech, similar to Pharaoh being like the leader of Egypt, Abimelech is also kind of like the king of the Philistines. So again, he lies to King Abimelech saying, oh no, this is my sister, not my wife. And Abimelech finds out, and actually Abimelech ends up looking like the one who's more righteous, saying, why did you lie to me? And so the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household. So again, there's this idea that people are having difficulty having children. Even the fringe characters are concerned about having children. Not just the main characters in the family, but everybody's concerned about this. So this is not just specifically focused on Abraham's immediate family. Lots of people all around are interested in, what do I do with my barrenness? And then also, what do we do when there's a famine? Because every single generation in Abraham's family, they have to move different places, bless you, to get resources to deal with the famine. Okay, so Genesis 21, Isaac arrives, and Ishmael, he teases Isaac, and Sarah says, get those out of here. This is how I'm going to resolve conflict. There's conflict between me and Hagar, and me and Ishmael. I do not like him. In fact, I wasn't even present at his birth. It's clear that she was not present at his birth. And now there's conflict between here. So Sarah's solution is, get those people out of my family. This is the way I deal with conflict. I don't like them. Send them away. As if this is a nice and easy solution. But we're going to see that this is not necessarily the best way to handle things. So there's this big line. We never see Hagar again in the story. Ishmael does come back to bury Abraham with Isaac, but he's no longer like very present in the story. Instead, the narrator moves the focus to Isaac and beyond. What happens after the binding of Isaac, after the sacrifice of Isaac, when God produces a ram instead of Isaac? There's this back at the ranch thing, where the narrator's telling the story, and the narrator then says, pause, back at the ranch, back in Padam Haram, there's this specific girl named Rebecca who's born. He's trying to kind of tell us, Rebecca is going to be the new person, the new matriarch that's going to enter into the Abrahamic story. So Rebecca's right here, so the narrator kind of forecasts what's going to happen. Now there's this person, Rebecca, because the next question is, how is Isaac going to continue to have babies, right? There's been challenges with infertility here. Is Isaac going to have the same sort of thing? And yes, Isaac will experience the same sort of thing with Rebecca, but at least there's some mate for Isaac coming down the road. And then we find out that Sarah dies. Sarah passes away. Now I want to look at the locations of where these individuals are in the story. So, at the very end of 22, the binding of Isaac, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So this is where Abraham is. You see this? Then there's this back at the ranch, Rebecca at the ranch, where Rebecca is. And then, imagine no chapter breaks. So in our English Bibles, we have the chapter, sometimes there's a summary, of what, like the name of the chapter, there's the chapter number, they tell us where the chapters start, but in the original text, there were no number breaks like this. There were no phrases describing what the rest of this chapter is about. So for example, when we look at the chapter of how Jacob deceived Isaac, it's often called like Jacob's deception, something like that. Someone has told us what this chapter is about. Imagine there are no chapter breaks. So this is where Abraham is, back at the ranch with Rebekah, and the very next sentence is, now Sarah lived 120 years, 27 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham came in to mourn for Sarah, literally came up or came in to mourn for her. So Abraham's living in Beersheba, we see that? But Sarah dies in Hebron. So Sarah dies in a different place than Abraham is living. The distance is about 26 miles between them. Here's a picture of Google Maps, Beersheba and Hebron. And up here is Ogden SDA Church, about 26 miles down south. Oh, there we go. Oh, down. Maybe the computer doesn't like this. Right below Woods Cross. And if you look at this, is the connection not great? Oh, that looks good. That looks stable. Nice work. Appreciate that. So this is 26 miles right along the roads. This right here, this 26 miles, I mean, there's some roads here, but it's not like as straight as the crow flies. There's some mountainous areas. So it's about a 26-mile gap between where Abraham was living to where Sarah passed away. So I don't know what's going on here. I'm not talking about the computer. I don't know what's going on in the story. But I do know Sarah has had a difficult life. She lived in a metropolitan area, highly cultured, that had running water, paved streets, et cetera, et cetera. She's taken to this nomad place, promised children, has had to wait a very long time to have children, very long time. Has had difficulty with Hagar and with Ishmael, and there's no mention in the text. Oh, also, her husband lied about her being his sister and not his wife, so twice she was taken into the king's group of women. We don't know exactly what happened or not happened, but just the fact that your husband is lying about who you are to save his own skin. And then finally, there's nothing in Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, that indicates that Abraham said anything to Sarah about taking Isaac up to the mountain. So Sarah might have had a difficult life. So I don't know exactly what's happening here. I just know that she passes away, and she's a long ways away from Abraham. I'm going to let you decide what that might mean for you. But this is what we know in the story. This is what's happening. So Genesis 24, Abraham is concerned about finding a wife for Isaac, and so he gets his trusted head servant. It says, all right, you need to go find a wife for my son. And luckily, the narrator has already told us there's someone named Rebekah. But Abraham doesn't know that. His head servant doesn't know that. Only the readers know. We have this special knowledge that there's this person named Rebekah. What's going to happen here? And so there's this quest to try and find this wife. Then there's this moment at the well where Eliezer prays to God to show him the right person. Then there's this message. Then there's this moment. And there's this invitation to bring Rebekah back home. And Rebekah and the head servant come back. And we see Rebekah lifts up her eyes in the field and sees this person. And who is this? And then Isaac lifts up his eyes and sees Rebekah. And then Isaac brought her into his mother's tent. So it's clear the narrator is saying, okay, Rebekah is the new matriarch of the family. She's taking on that role. And he loved her, thus Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So Isaac is still grieving the passing of his mother at the same time that he's receiving a new wife. So it's clear, at least in my mind, this individual is probably experiencing at least two strong emotions, right? Grieving the passing of your mother, but also being overjoyed at having a new wife. We can experience more than one emotion at once. And sometimes these emotions are powerful. And sometimes these powerful emotions will push us to do certain behaviors. And we'll see this later on when someone has a powerful emotion, what happens when they can't get a grip on it, and what kind of things they do when they have these powerful emotions. We know that Abraham takes another wife, and he has 6 other children with them. And with these other, so he sends these 6 kids off so that they are away from Isaac, and he gives Isaac the rest of his inheritance. So Isaac is a very wealthy man, very wealthy man. And so he's wealthy, but when we stack him up next to Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, sometimes people see Isaac as passive. He's just there in the story. People do things to him. In fact, he only has one whole chapter to himself in chapter 26. But even before we get to hear a full chapter just about Isaac, he's kind of upstaged by his two twins that are coming, Jacob and Esau. And so Isaac sometimes is seen as weak or passive or milquetoast, like this boring slice of bread that has no flavor. It's just there. It's just a vehicle for peanut butter or honey or something like that. But I don't think that's actually what's happening with Isaac, because Isaac actually does some pretty miraculous things. It's just when you stack him up against other big characters in the family, it just doesn't seem like he does quite as much as the rest of them. But let's look at this. I don't know if you can see this. So this is Mark Wahlberg, and this is Anthony Mackie, and this is Dwayne Johnson, The Rock. And if you can see their shoulders, it's clear they've seen the inside of a weight room. They're big. I mean, they have some muscle. I mean, I wouldn't, if I saw them walk across the street and they're coming towards me, I might want to move to the other side of the street. They're big boys. But look at how they look when they're put next to other men who are very large. This is Shaquille O'Neal. This is Charles Barkley. And look at little old Mark Wahlberg right here. Looks like he's 11 years old next to these big guys. Over here he looks fine, but look how short he looks, right? Like he probably rides his bike to school. Another example over here, this is Russell Wilson, former quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks, now quarterback of the Denver Broncos. And here's his big receivers like 6'3", DK Metcalf, like 230 pounds, solid muscle. It's clear he's a big boy, but look at this. He doesn't even have his driver's license over here. Next to Manute Bol, he looks like this little tiny kid. So who you're around definitely changes the way that people see you, right? If you grew up in a family that had a sibling that was like a superstar, you might always feel like you're trying to fight for attention in their shadow. Or if you grew up with a sibling that was always acting out, always like protesting and crossing boundaries and never listening to rules, you might feel like, oh, as long as I don't mess up, I'll be just fine, right? But that same person, I'll be just fine, if that same person grew up in a family with this big individual like this who was like a rock star, like, doing just fine may not seem like it's enough. So who we grow up with and who we're next to definitely changes the way people see us. So I think this is the reason why sometimes Isaac is seen as passive, because he's around, Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, but Isaac just seems really small. But he's not that small. He does some amazing things. Let's look at what he does. Whoa. So he's the first male and the only male to pray to God regarding the infertility of his wife. So Isaac is the first person to do this that we see recorded, praying to God for the infertility of his wife. And we know that Rebekah is concerned about what's happening because there are some children inside of her that are struggling. And Rebekah says, why is this happening to me? She's also crying out to God. And if you have your smartphones, if you want to, on the next slide, we will watch, if you want to look at this, this is an ultrasound of two babies that are fighting inside of the womb. If this is what you want to see what it looks like. And these kids are kind of going back and forth. So imagine a mother who's experienced infertility for about 20 years is trying to conceive and now has these two children who are fighting inside of her. And at this point in time, we don't have the same sort of medical advantages or technology that we do now. This would be very concerning for her own health, as well as for her two babies' health. Okay, so this is what the genogram looks like right now. We have Esau and Jacob, twins, right? We know that Rebekah is the younger daughter of Bethuel and whoever her mother is. And now over here, Rebekah and Isaac. Let me try this. Hope I didn't do something. So now that we know the new focus is on these twins, right? The twins, we have Esau and Jacob. And we know right from the get-go there's some tension between them. Even inside the womb they are fighting. And this is nothing new, right? Because in the previous generation, we know that Ishmael was Isaac and Isaac. And even before then, we know Cain and Abel had some challenges, right? So sibling rivalry is present so far in almost every single family in Genesis. And this will definitely continue on definitely in the next generation as well. Is this my screen right now? Okay, thank you. Try and back out of it and jump back in. Thank you. Cool. Okay. So we know that these parents have favorite children. We know that Isaac preferred Esau. He liked the hunter Esau. And we also know that Rebekah liked Jacob, because Jacob is a man of the tents. So it's clear that they have their preferred child. We know that Esau was this skillful hunter, and Isaac had this taste for wild game. So it's kind of forecasting what's going to be happening later on in the story. Moving on here. Okay. So, get a little drink of water here. I'm imagining if I was sitting in a therapy room and I had two brothers coming in for family therapy, one of the things we do is reenactment, where we ask them to replay what happened in the story so that I can observe it, and then we can have some conversation about what just happened. So, in this story of Jacob and Esau, remember that story when Esau comes in and he's famished, and he says, give me some of that red soup, give me some of that lentil soup. Have we heard of the story before? Okay. Oftentimes the story is framed as a critique on Esau. Man, Esau, he's just a man of the moment. He doesn't care about long-term prosperity. He doesn't care about his birthright. In fact, he despised his birthright. What a bad person, what a short-sighted individual. He's a hunter. And even the way the narrator tells the story, it's almost like Jacob received food and he inhaled it. But I would like to propose that this story is actually more of a critique on Jacob than Esau. During that time, if you're making a pot of soup, it's not like a top ramen or a cup of noodle soup or even macaroni and cheese soup. It's a big pot of soup for the community, right? It's not a single serving. It's like pulling out, you make a big old pan of lasagna and you pull it out, so either everyone has already eaten and now these are leftovers, or everyone is about to eat, they just haven't eaten yet. Regardless, he has this big lasagna pan, this big pot of soup, and this is when he tries to take advantage of his brother. And I guarantee you he did not exact this sort of price from everyone else in the camp when they came to eat this food, right? So it's clear that Jacob is taking advantage of the situation. Swear to me first, Jacob said. So Esau swore to Jacob and sold him his birthright. Then Jacob, only after that, then he gave him some bread and some lentil stew to Esau, who ate and drank and got up and went away. You look at these, who ate, drank, got up, went away. There's this person who's just all about action. Thus, Esau despised his birthright. I think that there is a question about how to interpret this. So did he despise his birthright after this experience? Or is this experience showcasing how Esau despised his birthright? This is an example of how he despised. Think about it. Esau is a hunter, right? He wants to be out and about hunting. Jacob wants to be home with the tents. So if you're an individual, pretend that Esau is a free spirit. He wants to hunt, he wants to be out and about. There's a lot of responsibility that comes along with being the firstborn of the family. Because here is how the inheritance is split up. Let's say you have 10 children, 10 boys. The firstborn son gets his piece of the pie, then he gets an extra piece just because he's the firstborn and he's expected to carry on the family line. So he gets his piece, an extra piece, then everything else is split up amongst the 9 other sons. So in this situation, if there's 10 boys, the eldest son has a little extra, but he has a responsibility to take care of the family. These other 9 do not have the same degree of responsibility. In this situation over here, you have the eldest son who also gets half of whatever's left because he's the eldest, and the youngest only gets 1/3. So what's happening here, Jacob is exchanging his 1/3 of the inheritance for Esau's 2/3. So in this one transaction of this one bowl of soup, Jacob is saying, I want double the inheritance. And you can have this piece of bread and this bowl of soup. I think this is trying to tell us what sort of individual Jacob is in the story. He's willing to take advantage of his brother, not just in the current situation, but long-term future implications. Here's Isaac. Finally we come to Isaac's main chapter, where he's able to trick Abimelech. He uses the same sort of lie that his father did, but this is my sister. He digs wells, he grows wheat. And in this part of the world, there's this big kind of contrast between people who are nomads, more Bedouin life, versus people who are city folk, living in the city. And sometimes, if you live in the city, you'd say, come live in the city where there's community and there's more organization, and then you'll be happy. But if you don't want to live in the city, you say, buy a goat, and then you'll be happy. So it's clear that Isaac can live in both worlds. He's able to grow wheat at 100 times fold per crop. So maybe his parents passed on some of their information they learned in Ur, because remember how Ur had this advanced technology. Maybe some of that was passed on to Isaac. But it's also clear he's able to be successful. He's able to build wells, to dig wells. So it's clear that Isaac is good at whatever he's doing. He can find water, he can grow wheat, he can take care of himself. Isaac is the only person in the Abrahamic narrative that does not leave the land of Canaan. Every other individual moves about, but Isaac stays in that area. And now there's this question, okay, so Jacob has the birthright now, right? He has double the inheritance, and Esau has half of what he just had. But Rebekah is thinking, boy, wouldn't it be nice if my favorite son, who's the youngest son, wouldn't just have the birthright, but would also have the blessing? Because if my favorite son could have the blessing and the birthright, then I would be set up. Because essentially, my youngest son, whom I prefer over Isaac, would have the blessing and the birthright, and he would be responsible for carrying on the family. And if he can get this blessing, the blessing is about God's blessing of prosperity that Isaac would give the son, which includes the idea of fertility. Thus, the father's blessing is related to the chance of future progeny. Now, we already know in the story that God has said that the younger one will be blessed and the older will serve the younger. We know this is going to happen because that's what God has said. But Rebekah is taking things into her own hands, right? And she's able to get Jacob to deceive his father. This is basically elder abuse, right? Coming in, tricking your elder, tricking him out of the blessing that he does not want to give you. He's reserving for someone else. And there are many questions that Isaac has. He's saying, who are you, my son? How is it that you've returned so quickly, my son? For you've gone out and you must have been really successful hunting, not knowing that this is his actually youngest son, not Esau, who's dressed up in this Halloween costume to look like Esau. Please come close that I might feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not. So it's clear that Isaac has lots of questions. Like he's sniffing out that something doesn't quite smell right. He has all these questions about what's happening. And after he comes close, he smells him, smells the garments. He's using all of his senses to try and figure out, is this really my son Esau? It's like he doesn't quite trust what's happening. I wonder if that's because he knows a little bit about who Jacob is. And there are major consequences for this family, right? Because after this happens, this deception happens, in rushes Isaac, and he has his food. Father, come and bless me. I have the food for you. And that's when terrible things happen in the family because Jacob has to run away, right? Because Esau says he's going to kill him. So Rebekah says, Jacob, go back to Padam Haran, find a wife, stay for a little bit, wait for Esau to simmer down, then you can come back. But Jacob never sees his mother again. So Rebekah's attempt to resolve what she wanted, trying to get something for her son, actually ended up splitting up the family. And Jacob runs away over to Laban's family. So the question is, how much are we willing to sacrifice in our own family to get what we want? As an individual, what am I willing to sacrifice to do what I think is best for me? Am I willing to sacrifice my other family members' well-being? That seems to be happening so far in this family, and we're going to see that in future generations as well. So Esau said, is he not rightly named Jacob, for he has betrayed me these 2 times? He took away my birthright for a bowl of soup, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. He said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? So Esau held a grudge against Jacob. Here's this word grudge. We're going to be talking about this tomorrow in the sermon, this grudge that's being held against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning from my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. So there's this intent to get rid of my brother because of this deception. So Jacob has to run up north to Padam Haran. And remember, this is where the family had come through before. So he goes back to where his family was, where his grandfather and grandmother were before they came down. So he's kind of going back to the old stomping grounds, back where my family came from. And we know that Jacob meets these two daughters, right? He meets Rachel and Leah. And he had this strong preference for Rachel, right? Very strong preference for Rachel. In fact, he was willing to work for 7 years for Rachel. And then when it came to the wedding, Laban did the old switcheroo and instead gave him Leah, right? And somehow he didn't realize this little piece of deception. And then Laban says, well, okay, well, I'll also give you my daughter Rachel, who I know you were interested in. But then you have to work another 7 years after that. So he ends up working 7 plus 7, not 7. 7 plus 7 is 14 years for the one wife he's interested in and the wife that he's not interested in. And that's super clear who he's interested in and who he shows his affection to. In fact, the lying that we see is like the same lie from the same playbook. So Abraham first lies to Pharaoh about his wife. And he says, this is my sibling. And he does this to save his own skin. Right? The second time that Abraham lies, he lies to King Abimelech. And he also says, this is my sibling, in order to save his own skin. Right? And then, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So Isaac used the same exact line. He says, me too, this is my sibling. He lies about Rebekah, again, to save his own skin. Well, if 1 is good, and 2 is good, and 3 is good, I'm going to one-up you one more. So Jacob's first lie is prompted by Rebekah. He lies to Isaac saying, I am my sibling. Right? And here is my skin. Right? He put on this goat skin. But notice, Rebekah is the one who prompted Jacob for this. And Rebekah is the sister of Laban, right? So think about what Laban did and what through Leah, he essentially did the same sort of thing. Leah, prompted by Laban, lies to Jacob, essentially saying, me too, I am my sibling, and this is my skin. So this lying, this is my sibling, I am my sibling, who we are in the family is a big deal. If you have siblings that go before you in the educational system, and they have some reputation, and the teachers know who they are, oh, you're Isaiah's sister. Okay, I know who you are. Or, oh, you're Isaiah's sister. Well, we're going to have a good time in the classroom. All of a sudden, people already make some snap judgments about who you are based on who your sibling is. And so who you are in your family and who your siblings are definitely plays a big role, even in this narrative. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people in here who had siblings that went through the educational system and may have had to sometimes try and emulate your sibling to get more attention or get less attention or get the type of attention you are preferring. Because sometimes we're envious and jealous of the attention or the things that our siblings get. And that's difficult if you don't know how to navigate that, especially if parents aren't able to help out. In this family, it doesn't seem like parents help out very much. In fact, sometimes the parents are getting in and they're mixing things up maybe more than they should. So we know that God blessed tender-eyed Leah. We know that Rachel is beautiful, but Leah is tender-eyed. And so she names these sons, hoping to get her husband's affection, because she's not getting the sort of affection she wants. Eventually, with Judah, she changes the name of her sons to more focus on God. This time, I'll praise the Lord. How fortunate, that's what Gad's name means. So there's this shift when Leah's trying to have children. The first few are about how do I get my husband's attention. Then it's, you know what, I know he's not willing to give me my attention, so I'm going to be focusing on God. So I imagine Leah's life was fairly lonely because her sister gets all the attention from her husband. And there are these infertility, barren wars between Leah and Rachel. Each of them want to have children, and they also give Jacob their handmaids. Zilpah and Bilhah is Rachel's handmaid. And so there's this story in Genesis 30 about Reuben, the eldest son, finding these mandrakes in the field. So he's out in the field, he finds these mandrakes, he brings them to his mother Leah, because these mandrakes have some special properties that are supposed to help with infertility. And Rachel comes and says, where is it? Please give me some of your son's mandrakes. So Rachel comes and demands of her sister, who's not getting the attention, give me some of your son's mandrakes. But Leah said to her, is it a small matter for you to take my husband? Would you now take my son's mandrakes also? So it's clear that in this family, Leah is not having access to her husband, and Rachel is hoarding her husband. So Rachel said, therefore he may lie with you tonight, return for your son's mandrakes. I'll make a trade with you. You can have him, but I get those mandrakes. So Leah is in this difficult position. What am I supposed to do? I want the mandrakes, but I also want my husband, so how am I going to navigate this? So this is what the mandrakes look like, and they open up to flowers, and these are what the roots look like. These look kind of anthropomorphic. Do you see that? Almost like there's like arms and legs, kind of like a little body underneath the earth. In fact, different cultures believed that these had some special powers. And they were worn as amulets, or they were cut up and put into water like tea, and as an aphrodisiac or as a way to help someone get pregnant. But these are actually deliriant hallucinogenic tropane alkaloids. So these are, they're drugs. That's basically what's happening. So that's what the exchange is all about. There's this Pashto proverb, I was swift in my revenge, I only waited 100 years. How long has Esau been waiting? His brothers run away. His brother's married, 2 women, has had children, and now Jacob runs away from Laban. As he's running away, he has this idea, what's going to happen when I go and see my brother Esau again? And when he's running away, Laban runs after the family because Jacob's like, look, Laban has changed my wages. He's not been fair to us. Let's run. So he takes all his and he runs away. Laban finds out about it, runs after them, and says, where are my idols? You see, Rachel had taken some family idols with her as the whole family had run away back to Canaan. And so Laban is running after them, trying to find out where are these idols. And what's happening is Rachel is in this tent, sitting on the camel saddle, and Laban comes in looking for the saddle, looking for the idols, and Rachel says, you can't come in here because it's my time of the month, and so you can't look in here, so therefore Laban is never able to find these idols. We find that Jacob is saying, what idols? It sounds like Jacob doesn't know anything about it, but we'll see later on in a few chapters, the idols are mentioned another time, but there's no surprise from Jacob that these idols were found. So I don't know if Jacob was in on this deception as well. So we know Jacob is afraid of Esau. Israel reunites with Esau. So if you read Genesis 33, I want you to read this sometime and think about the echoes of the prodigal son. You remember the prodigal son story where you have the older father, you have the prodigal son returning home, the father runs after him. The same sort of thing happens here with Esau and Jacob. And we see that Esau has changed. But we don't know if Jacob has, right? In fact, he's continued the sort of deception thing. So we knew that Esau has changed, and this beautiful reception by the brother. And then there's the story of Dinah in chapter 34, where there's a sexual assault happens, and Jacob does nothing. He doesn't want to get involved. In fact, for some reason, he's changed. This manipulator no longer wants to get involved. In fact, he's upset because he's worried about how the Canaanites and the Perizzites are going to treat him and his family. He's more concerned about his own skin than concerned about the skin of his family. So what is Jacob and Israel? What are they about now? What are they interested in? What is he interested in? And it's clear he's interested in Rachel and Rachel's son, right? He's interested in Joseph. That's who he's interested in. There's this story. So Rachel passed away. Benjamin is born. Reuben sleeps with Bilhah. Jacob does nothing about this. Jacob is renamed Israel a second time by God. Jacob sees his father, Isaac again, no Rebekah. Then Esau's descendants are mentioned. And here's what's going on with the story. So now going back to the genogram, we have these 2 sons of Zilpah and Jacob. We have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sons of Leah and Jacob. We have Dinah here. We have 1 son from Jacob and Rachel, and then 2 sons, Benjamin, and then 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali, from Jacob and Bilhah. So now everyone's here, but we know these brothers don't necessarily get along, right? Because the brothers don't like Joseph. Here's why they don't like Joseph. He's a tattletale. He tattletaled on his brothers to his father about something they have done, so they don't like that. They don't like that clearly Joseph is Israel's favorite. They don't like that. They don't like that he is gifted this coat of many colors. They don't like that. They don't like that he has different labor responsibilities. They have to go around with the flocks, but in the story that we're about to look at, it's clear that he's at home at the tents with Israel, and Israel sends him out as a messenger boy. Go and talk with them, and then come back. So it's kind of clear that Joseph has a more cush lifestyle. He doesn't have to have the same responsibilities. And then he has these dreams about his brother and family bowing down to him, 2 of them, and he shares both of them. This is why his brothers don't like him. They can't stand him. And his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. This is the conflict we were talking about, this frustration that we can't get rid of in our family. They hated him, that's a strong word, and they could not find a way to speak to him on friendly terms. That means when Thanksgiving rolled around, they could not speak to him politely or kindly. They just couldn't bring themselves to do it. This family has difficulty resolving conflict. In fact, when the brothers have this beautiful solution, how do they get rid of this person they don't like? This should sound very similar to what Sarah wanted to do. Just send them off. Just take him, sell him as a slave to some traders that are actually cousins going down to Egypt, and we'll turn a profit on this. And then they kill an animal, they spread the blood on his beautiful robe, and they take the robe back to the father, say, look, your son was destroyed by a wild beast. And let's notice that in 2 generations, there was a deception using an animal. Even animals aren't safe around this family when people are trying to lie. And when we lie and deceive and take advantage of other people, stuff is spread around the rest of the family, and it's clear that Israel is like torn from this. In fact, it's mentioned that he tears his clothes in grief because his favorite son is no longer there. So he prefers Rachel, doesn't prefer Leah. And if his favorite son has passed away, who's he going to turn his attention to? Probably the next son of Rachel, the youngest of the family, baby Benjamin. And it's clear that baby Benjamin is his favorite son as we move forward. So we hear the story of Judah and Tamar, and then we go to Genesis 39. Joseph prospers in Egypt, and then he's imprisoned, and then he's the dreamer again. Joseph seems to have some sort of prescient knowledge about what's going to happen because God gives him some understanding of what's going to happen. And he interprets Pharaoh's dream about there's going to be a famine, so there are going to be some years when we have lots of produce, and harvesting grain. We're going to store all those in silos because then after that we're going to have a few years that are fairly light. There's going to be a famine in the land. And so Pharaoh says, "Oh, thanks so much for telling me about this dream. I want to put you in charge. You're kind of the viceroy of Egypt." And so Joseph is now in charge of this big superpower, right? I mean, Mesopotamia was a big superpower, and Egypt was also a big superpower. So now he's basically the second in command of all of Egypt for all that land and the surrounding regions. And then his brothers, who experience a famine, have to come down to Egypt to get some food. And if you remember the story, the brothers come in, and they see Joseph, but they don't know it's Joseph, because they think he probably passed away. He's there. Joseph is using an interpreter, so he knows what his brothers are saying, but they don't know that it's him. So he sends them home with their food, but he also puts some coin in their packs, and he asks them all these questions about their family, like, who's your father? What about your brothers? Asks them all these questions, very specific questions that a viceroy probably wouldn't know about. And he ends up imprisoning Simeon, saying, well, Simeon, you have to stay here. All the other brothers can go back, but if you bring this youngest brother that you talked about, if you bring your youngest brother back, then I will release Simeon. So the brothers they go back home, and they run out of food again, and they end up bringing their youngest son Benjamin back again, the new favorite son of Jacob, brings him back down to Egypt. Joseph seats all the brothers in birth order, and the brothers are like, wow, how does he know this special information? He must have some special divination knowledge. And later on in the story, there's this divination cup that people would use to foretell the future. We don't know if Joseph actually used that, But the brothers, sir, think that something magical is going on. Otherwise, how would he have this information at his fingertips? And he sends them away with their food. So all of the brothers are going back to Canaan. And then Joseph sends someone running after them saying, stop, stop. You stole something from us. And the brothers say, we didn't steal anything. You can look at all of our packs. So the servant looks in every single brother's pack. And the very last sack that he opens is Benjamin's sack. And lo and behold, in this sack is this divination cup. And all of the brothers tear their clothes in grief. Finally, we see the brothers tearing their clothes because they're grieved over what's going to happen to this favored son, Benjamin. We've been waiting for several chapters for this to happen. In fact, I think the whole reason that Joseph is doing this, he is testing the family system. He's testing to see what the rules are on the family. Because up at this point in time, rules have been, I take advantage of you to get something for me. And it would have been very, very simple for these brothers to go back to Israel without Benjamin and say, sorry, the viceroy of Egypt took your youngest son, your favorite son, the one that you love. We couldn't do anything about it. They could have easily done that. But instead, they tear their clothes and they all walk back to Egypt, arms in arms, going back, pleading their case for the viceroy, Joseph, to not take Benjamin away. And that's when Joseph reveals who he is to his brothers. And he weeps on them. He can't contain it anymore. And he says, go back and get your father, bring the whole family down to Egypt, and he takes care of them. That's near the end of the story. So let's take a breath. We've gone pretty quickly through, it's been an hour and 20 minutes. It's the whole story of Abraham's family, an hour and 20 minutes. Let's go back to these questions. What are some of Abraham's family rules? What are the rules that are happening each family generation? What are the patterns that are passed down from generation to generation? How do people handle anxiety and tension and conflict in the family? And then who are the villains? Who are the heroes? Let's look. We use Deanogram to help us out. So a couple themes are happening in each generation. One, there's defiance. I put these little dotted boxes around these and put a red D as well as this little red thing in the top left corner. These are the individuals that are defiant. So in each generation, there's at least one person who's defiant. And when you look at these people, are these the heroes, quote unquote, or are these the villains of the story? I mean, it's clear that the family line is following through these individuals, but these other people are pretty defiant. So let's kind of hold this, let's suspend this. Next theme. These are the individuals who are lying. So Abraham, Sarai, Isaac, Rebekah, Laban, Jacob, Rachel, Joseph as well, lying about who he is, Dan and Naphtali as well, and these other sons. So there's a lot of lying going on in each generation, a lot of defiance going on in each generation. Here's some conflict now. In every single generation, there's conflict people having difficulty with. So conflict in this marital relationship, conflict in this marital relationship, conflict in this marital relationship. Every single generation has conflict. In every single generation, there's favoritism towards the younger offspring. Every single generation, favoritism toward the younger offspring. In every single generation, there's some sort of manipulation that's happening. Severe manipulation, taking advantage of someone else for your own good, for your own advantage. And right now, does this look like a family you'd want to go visit on Sabbath afternoon? It's not new to one generation. This is old stuff, right? This has been passed down from generation to generation to generation. So this has been practiced and honed and then gifted to the next person, and they continue to perfect their craft. Defiance or lying or resolving conflict or not resolving conflict. Cutoff is a big deal in this family. Let's notice. Here's the first cutoff. So Hagar runs away from Sarah, comes back, and then runs away is kicked out from Sarah. We know that Jacob runs away from Esau. Then he runs away from Laban as well. And we know that Joseph is sold to the Ishmaelites, essentially kicked out of the family. So this seems to be, getting rid of someone. And Abraham's family mafia is, I want to get rid of this person. Take him out. That's how they resolve conflict. just get rid of the person. Now, we can't really do that in all of our families, right? Well, some families we can. Sometimes this is what happens. I'm not talking to you anymore. You're dead to me, that sort of thing, right? We turn our back on that family member. We're kicking them out as the black sheep, ostracizing them from our family. And that's the way we are resolving conflict. The question is, when we do this, when we kick someone out of the family, get to that side, does that actually resolve the conflict? No, it doesn't. Then where does the conflict go? Where does that tension go? Instead of being up here, it seeps down into the ground, into the family system. It's latent. Oh, it's still there, but it's just latent. Imagine if there's say there's a 17-year-old male who lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and he's not getting along with his parents. He doesn't like his parents' rules. He has to be inside by 9:30 p.m., and all of his friends can stay out till 11. He doesn't like his family rules, so he says, I'm going to take a Greyhound bus and take it all the way over to Ogden, Utah. I'm going to live here in Ogden, Utah, away from my parents. And now I'm going to get away from them. Do you think that tension between him and his parents disappears? No, it's still there. How do I know it's still there? Because when he's living with his aunt and uncle here in Ogden, Utah, he finds out his parents are coming to visit for Christmas. Oh boy, what do I do? Now I have to face them. I have to face the music again. I have to see this person. I have this unresolved conflict, this unresolved tension. Oh, it's still there. It's still present. So kicking someone out of the family does not resolve the conflict. It's a question. Everybody's running from something. Was Abraham running from anything? I think he was running from infertility. He and his wife had difficulty with that, and God promised him offspring and land, and this is in direct result of what happened early in Genesis 3 about pain of the land and pain of childbirth. So Abraham is running towards something and away from something else. This cutoff right here between Ishmael and Isaac, this didn't resolve itself in one generation, did it? In fact, when you think about what's happening in current geopolitical climate, and what's been happening for thousands of years, the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac have had conflict for thousands of years, for millennia. So kicking someone out of the family does not resolve the conflict. And if families learn to carry that grudge with them to the next generation, then we pass on that grudge again to the next generation, all of a sudden, this becomes this insurmountable rift, seemingly insurmountable rift. The individuals have to try and figure out how to navigate it. One of the ways they navigate it is not have anything to do with the other person, and then you start to develop stories and narrative about the other side, and you develop some prejudice about the other side, and all of a sudden, this unresolved conflict, because it's latent, starts to seep into everything that we do, and it can destroy families. So, who are the villains? In this story, we'll specifically look at the brothers who were selling Joseph. They are often seen as the villains, right? They took their brother, they threw him into a pit, stripped him naked, then sold him as a slave to go down to Egypt. They are seen as the villains. But these brothers, kicking someone out, lying to their father, taking advantage of the situation, is that anything new? No. In fact, they were following the same family rules that occurred in the previous generations, right? They're just doing the same thing that they were taught how to do. And we see them as the villains, as if they are the bad person. And as soon as we start to see the individual that has the behavior that we don't like as the bad person, you need to change what you're doing. You're bad. And we don't see the context of where they learned that behavior, it's really easy to point the finger when maybe some of the other fingers are also pointing back at you. The whole family bears some responsibility for passing on these behaviors. It's not just Joseph's brothers who are the bad ones, because they learned how to do this somehow, right? They were just wrapping it up in one big sweet package, borrowing from Laban and Rebekah and Sarah and Jacob. They were just trying to take everything to their advantage. And so in some ways, like, this is the magnum opus of these family rules, right? They did the best out of the rest of the family when it comes to these rules. Take advantage of someone, manipulating them, lying them, because there's always conflict. The younger son receives the blessing in each generation, conflict between siblings, and do whatever is expedient. That seems to be all the way throughout. What do I do right now? And expediency is not always the best way to resolve conflict. It's the hard work of sitting down and working things out. That's how we resolve conflict. But this expedient solution of kick them out, it might seem like it's an elegant solution, it's nice and clean, but it never resolved the conflict. So let's look at what's happening. We're near the end of Abraham versus Isaac versus Jacob's life satisfaction. There are 3 different phrases talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's life satisfaction. The first one in Genesis 25. These are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived. He lived 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man, and satisfied with his life. So he died old and satisfied with his life. Next generation, Isaac. The narrator gives us another sentence. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years old, 5 years more. Then Isaac breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people, an old man of ripe age. What's missing here in this sentence? Yeah, satisfied with life, right? Let's see what happens with the next generation. Jacob has come before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my living are abroad are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life." Satisfied, not satisfied, not bad. Unpleasant. When anxiety is trapped in the family system and it's never resolved, and it's passed down to the next generation, there's a compounding effect, right? A lot of the anxiety we deal with now is old. It's not new to us. It's been passed down to us from other generations. Not just the anxiety, but the behavior patterns, our ineffective coping mechanisms, which help bind that anxiety in our lives. That's also passed down. A lot of stuff we deal with right now, it's old. It's not even ours to begin with. So what do? First thing we do is notice these patterns. If we can pay attention to patterns in our family, what are things that I do? What are things that my siblings do? What are things my parents do? How about my grandparents? If we can increase our insight into these patterns, we can start to see, oh, there are patterns in our family, just like there are patterns in Abraham's family. And if we can see these patterns, all of a sudden there's a chance for us to change these patterns and resolve the conflict that has been passed down to us. At the very end of the story, he was told to Jacob, who is very, very old this time, "Behold, Joseph has come to you." And Joseph brings his 2 sons to Jacob to be blessed. And Jacob talks about the blessing of God. He says, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, 'Behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a multitude of peoples, and I will give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession.'" So he's reaffirming this covenant that God has given to him. And then he says, "Now your 2 sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine." Israel is saying, "Your 2 sons are mine. I am adopting your 2 sons. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are." So at the very end of his life, he adopts these 2 sons. And then he goes on to say something pretty interesting. "But your children you have fathered after me shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of your brothers and their inheritance. Now as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. I buried her there on the way to Ephrath," that is Bethlehem. So he talks about God, he talks about adopting these 2 children, and then he talks about his wife that passed away. I wonder if Israel is saying, "I'm taking your 2 sons, Joseph, I'm adopting them as mine, as if they are Rachel's sons." Because as you remember, Rachel died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. And then we would have Joseph, who he thought he lost, now has come back, and Benjamin, and then Joseph's 2 other sons. So now Rachel has 4 children. And when Joseph says, "I came here so you can bless them," Jacob says, "Come here," because the eyes of Israel are weak, and he says to Joseph, I have never expected to see your face, and behold, God has also allowed me to see your children as well. And so Joseph, he arranges these two kids so that Israel can just reach out his hands like this and bless them. But when Israel goes to bless them, he reaches out his right hand and he places it on Ephraim, who's the younger. He reaches out his left hand on Manasseh, he crosses his arms. And then he blesses these two children. And we see that Joseph does not like this. In fact, it displeased Joseph. He doesn't like this. So he grabbed his father's hand to move it. And Israel does not like that. And he says, because Joseph says to him, he says, not so, my father. For this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. This is how you're supposed to do it. But there's this elegant reply that Israel gives to him. And I want you to imagine the previous generation doing this. I know, my son, I know. But he will also become a people, and he will also be great. However, his younger brother shall become greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. Imagine if that happened in the previous generation with Jacob and Esau. Instead of Jacob deceiving his father, what would happen if after Isaac sent out Esau to get the wild game, when he comes back, then Isaac would say, bring your other son as well. So he has Esau and Jacob next to him. And all he would have had to done is cross his arms and bless the younger son. And if he would have done that, the family could have avoided a lot of unnecessary strife and conflict over multiple generations. Sure, there would have been some protest, but after that, what's done is done. In fact, this is what God said would happen. But instead, Rebekah told Jacob to deceive his father. He sees his father, he runs away, he never sees Rebekah again, and there's this big rift from the family. But notice what happens when we are expedient about trying to solve things for me right now in the here and present. There could be some unintended consequences. Okay, so closing with theological reflections. One, God chose to make and remake his covenant with people like this, with this sort of family. God chose this family to work with. He's willing to work with people who have difficulties. And people seem to work really, really hard, even taking advantage of other people in the family, to try and obtain what God has already promised them. Yet sometimes, in their attempt to take things for themselves, they seemingly put some of God's promises in jeopardy. I mean, Jacob running away from Padam, he's going backwards. God has promised him Canaan, but he's going backwards. Obviously, though, God works even harder to not let our dysfunction ruin his covenant. He does not base his covenant on our behavior. And it's a good thing, because we saw what family Abraham's was, and we also know what kind of family we come from, right? It's righteousness by faith for a reason. Sometimes the actions of one person can change the family tree. Joseph was different than his brothers, yeah? Sometimes we need a little bit of distance. If there's too much dysfunction in the family, sometimes we need a little bit of distance. But that's different from totally being cut off. In fact, God ordained it so that because he blessed Joseph, Joseph was able to bless his family and everyone else in the region. One person making a change can change the other behaviors in the family. We're not in control of other people. We're barely in control of ourselves on a good day. But one person has quite a bit of power to change and push back against some of the family patterns that are present in our family. So Jeremiah 31 says, in those days they will not say again, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. So I want to hear from those of you who are present. What are some things, some stuff that you noticed that I missed? How might this change the way you see Abraham's family? And how might this change the way you see your family or your romantic relationship with your partner? So what are some things that I missed that you noticed? How does this change the way you see Abraham's family? And how might this potentially help you in your family relationships? Yes, so noticing the patterns in previous generations, so the great-great-grandparents, the great-parents, parents, you, noticing how those patterns sift down amongst the generations. It only takes one person to have a powerful effect on the family tree. It may not be able to change previous generations, but they can definitely have an impact on future generations, right? If they can stop those patterns from passing through them, right? If you want to change things for your children, you don't change it in their generation, you change it in yourself. And changing it in yourself, then you're stopping those patterns from passing down. Good.
Now in my family, what I noticed is my two brothers that lives back in Wisconsin, since I went through that Oklahoma bombing, they don't want nothing to do with me, but like I'm dead to them.
And that's hard.
I know, very hard. I mean, because one time I asked them to see if they would borrow me some money. They told me, go jump in the lake.
It's hard when you're the person who is kicked out of the family, when you're no longer accepted.
And the reason why I think they kicked me out of the family is because when I went to that Oklahoma bombing, I had to wear diapers now like a baby does, and I think that's the reason why they didn't want nothing to do with me, because one day I tried to call them.
Mm-hmm.
They just hung up the phone and told me not to call anymore, or not even bother to get a bus ticket to come see them and stay with them or anything, because even when I was homeless, I wanted to stay with them for a while and maybe find me a place up there in Wisconsin to live. And they said, no, don't bother coming.
It's hard when people have a family member that they have a very specific narrative about. And even if that member has changed or circumstances have changed, the narratives, the old narratives, are sometimes stuck with us. And it's the narratives that are also passed down from generation to generation about the other side of the family or the other person. And so sometimes we pass on this information about who is the villain, who's the hero, about other family members to the next generation. So that knowledge is retained, even if it's not necessarily helpful. In fact, in Leviticus 19, God talks to Israel about how you shouldn't be holding a grudge for next generations. Because if you think about it, if you're allowed to hold on a grudge for a person you have a beef with as well as their children, and you pass that on to your children, and that continues down the generation, that's going to destroy the structure of society. God doesn't want us to hold grudges. And sometimes in our families, we hold grudges. Good. Tell me something that you noticed in Abraham's family that we missed today. Oh, a lack of trust in God. Tell me more. Yeah. God helps those who help themselves, right? Or we help ourselves, and maybe God will bless us afterwards.
Yeah, and then it got messy, and then God had another plan to fix that mess. Then it kept going.
It kept going, kept getting messier and messier. Yeah. It will continue to get messier and messier if we still have difficulty resolving conflict.
Abraham's family didn't want to really sit down and listen to what God had to say, and just, let me do it my way, and that, and they so big of a mess that.
A big mess. But this big mess, God still wanted to work with this big mess. He wasn't scared off by this big mess. Sometimes we think we have to come to God clean, present ourselves clean, and with no sin, with no foibles, with no faults. But God wants to work with us even though we're still experiencing dysfunction. He wants us. He wants us really bad.
That's why he died on the cross for our sins, so all we have to do is go to him with him and pray to him, and he'll forgive our sins.
Right. God built his covenant on himself and his own actions, not on our actions. Good. Anyone else want to chime in? Something you noticed in Abraham's family that you didn't see before, we didn't talk about, or how this might change the way the perspective you have of Abraham's family or the perspective of your own family?
Seems like the idea of fairness and is very important when favoritism is like poison.
Mm.
To be interviewed in the family, and it causes so many problems generationally. Learn or by nurture. How many times favoritism caused great grief.
Yeah. Favoritism versus fairness, right? It doesn't mean you have to treat your, let's say you have 2 children or 3 children, it does not mean you have to treat them the exact same way. In fact, it's probably best if you don't treat them all the exact same way. They have different needs, but more fair and equitable is important. If you prioritize one at the expense of the others, whew, there's going to be some conflict that the parents are introducing. Yes?
I think, anyway, the Bible, the way it says it was obvious the father liked the one and the mother liked the other.
Yeah.
But a lot of times when families growing up, our parents would favor a child and not realize they are until later that child says, well, you did this to this and this
Yep.
to this. And then you can see, oh,
Oh.
that's right, I did do that.
Yeah.
But not realizing at the time that you were doing that. Or it's not so obvious.
Agreed. Parents don't always recognize, for those of you at home who couldn't hear all of these great questions and comments, sometimes parents don't recognize that they might be slightly postured more towards one child compared to the others. And it's only later on that they realize that maybe the children bring that to their attention. Oh, you treated this person, Samantha, in a very different way than you treated Jimmy and Elizabeth. And so it's only afterwards the parents recognize that. So if you're a parent who wonders if you might inadvertently be doing that, think about the needs of your children. What do they need? And some children cause a little more high maintenance. They need a little more attention. And so sometimes their urgency of their behavior seems to demand our attention. And I don't want you to forget that it's also necessary to take care of the other children that also need your love and care. If all your attention is towards one, the others might be lost in the mix. So think about, who am I paying attention to more often? Who would I find myself gravitating toward? And try and take a step back, think about your own patterns, and then come back to the parenting intentionally and trying to address the needs of each child, instead of just going blindly along with the pattern the way you've always done it. A little bit of reflection can go a long way to change their experience in the family. Good. Any other observations about Abraham's family, how you see them, or how you see your own family?
And God told Abraham, out of your own bowels,
Yep.
your seed.
Mm-hmm.
He was telling him that through your seed that I will, or through your people.
Mm-hmm.
But Abraham lost sight of God. When he lost sight of God, he fought himself.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't take care of it myself. And so did Sarai.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing. So she didn't hang on. We as a church are in danger of, when God says you are my people, we are in danger of, oh, how do I want to do that?
Mm-hmm.
We can easily forget God ourselves. In a marriage, the last question, in a marriage, oh, I'm the wife. So you need to do what I say, honey. I got nothing to do with it. I'm inside of God. If I don't allow God to work in me, to love my husband, I'm in danger of it's all me.
And if I can continue on that train, one of the reasons we lose sight of God is we get anxious and impatient with the situation. And when that happens, well, it's time for me to step in and do what I think I should do. But humans are very poor judges of what's going to happen in the future. We think we might know. We are not very good at predicting what's going to happen, like next week, next month, next year. We are not good at that. And so if we're using our short-sighted judgment to make some decisions that have long-term implications, sometimes it's good to be patient, right? Good to be patient and wait on the Lord, but sometimes it's a gray area too, right? I mean, Abram and Sarai, later Abraham and Sarah, They waited a long time for children. Sometimes we're stuck in this season of life where we're doing so much more waiting than doing. And that's hard. It's hard to sit in the waiting. We would just want to go do something. But if we can manage that distress, this internal distress of, I want to be doing something, I don't want to be impatient. If we can manage that and pray to God and be patient, sometimes he directs us at how he wants us to go. But there are other times where it's still a gray area. Right? It's still sometimes not always 100% clear what we should do. And those are some difficult decisions as well. And when it comes to those decisions, if you recognize that this is a gray area, I'm not sure what I need to do, and you sense your anxiety or distress building up, take a step back, try and calm down, and make decisions in accordance with your values. You can't predict the future. You can't force an outcome. In fact, we saw lots of attempts to force the outcome here, right? You can't force an outcome. But if you can live in accordance with your values, at least you'll know that I'm doing what's right for me on the inside. And hopefully your values are in alignment with the divine. Hopefully you're close enough to Christ, you're connected with Christ, that his values are close to your values, and that's how you're living your life. Because these values, especially of expediency, this caused a lot of strife, perhaps unnecessary strife in the family. Good. Let me go back here. All human behavior makes sense when put in a specific context. In this story, this is the context of Genesis, the context of Abraham's family. Even the most destructive and self-sabotaging behavior serves a purpose. When trying to make sense of behavior you don't understand, ask yourself, how does this behavior protect me? Then ask yourself if there's a healthier way to meet that need. Every single behavior is a symptom of the system. Every behavior we do is a symptom of the system. Those brothers of Joseph, their behavior, selling him out as a slave, then tearing up his robes, bringing it back to dad, saying, sorry, your son has passed away, those were symptoms of the system. A lot of the behaviors we don't like in our family, oh, I don't like when she does this, I don't like when he does this, those are symptoms of the larger system. It's really easy to point the finger at behavior we don't like, stop that behavior. But this behavior is serving a purpose in the larger system. And maybe we need to look at the larger family rules about how we're supposed to handle conflict. And if we can take a step back and see that, we might start to see their behavior in a different light. Their behavior is serving some sort of role in the family. But what is it? And if we can get curious, instead of condemning it, there's opportunity for growth and change. But if we just come in and condemn it and say, what you're doing is bad, you're the villain in the family, we miss out on the responsibility that the rest of the family has in maybe changing the family patterns as a whole and the family rules instead of just telling one person to stop it. Good. I'm not destined to repeat the patterns of my own childhood. This is not automatic. If we don't reflect on it, then it becomes the default. But you can make changes at any age. Noticing your patterns, fighting against those patterns, choosing to dance in a different way, changing the way you move through life, and you can make changes in your generation and the following generations. And when you break these generational cycles, it has a powerful butterfly effect for the next generations as well as current generations. You might be able to repair old rifts in the family, old cutoffs, people who weren't speaking before. You can ask yourself, why aren't we speaking to these cousins? For 3 generations we haven't met with them. What's this old beef about? Do they even care anymore? Or is this something that our grandparents cared about? And you can reach out as long as it's safe, right? As long as safety is not an issue. You can reach out, especially with social media now. Like, the world is so much smaller than it was 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. You can reach out, and maybe these other generations might also be interested in repairing the rift. You never know. You never know. And if we just stay within our own family patterns, stuck in our own family patterns, we're not going to get anything new. We're going to get the same thing over and over and over. We may heal our own wounds, our own wounds, our own wounds, so that our children have cleaner canvas upon which to paint their own life. You don't clean up their canvas, you clean your canvas. Okay. I think we're done. Unless there are any final questions, I'll close with prayer. Yes?
I just think of how many times we took biblical advice, vengeance is mine. Beware,
Yes.
lest any root of bitterness come in, and thereby many be defiled because of your bitterness.
Yeah.
And then forgiveness is if you want to be forgiven, you've got to forgive. And I mean, just these principles that would go a long ways to avoid a lot of the conflicts, unresolved conflicts that we have.
Agreed. When God says, vengeance is mine, that is a gift to us. That is a gift. So we don't have to carry that vengeance to the next generation. That is a gift to us, so we don't have to carry that weight and pass that millstone on to the next generation. God is trying to change our lives. He doesn't want us to be stuck in the dysfunction, and there are opportunities for growth and change. Let's pray. Father God, I thank you for being determined and not giving up on us. I thank you for your peace. I thank you for being patient. I thank you for loving us and forgiving us, even though you know we come from families such as this. I pray that you give us the insight and the courage to see our own family patterns and know how to break these patterns, to change the way that we are acting with other people, trying to decide if these family rules actually fit our own family values and if they fit who you want us to be as children of God, as ambassadors of Christ. So I pray you bless us tonight. Bless our insight, bless our direction, and draw us closer to you. Amen.